At last the truck came to a halt. The venerable vehicle had carried the squad throughout the night and into the dawn of the fifth day of the less than stellar circumstances that brought them together. For hours now they had driven as far away as possible from the burning fields and towards the periphery of the hive, and after spotting no work activity, the commissar saw it fit to take a pause.
Everyone, we're pausing the drive for someone to go R&R,
Katerina announced before jumping out of the truck.
You get 15 minutes to work the road sickness out, then meet back here for regrouping. I'm going to be taking the teddy off our hall.
Well, I guess I'll do the usual and scope the place out. See you all after the quarter.
Probably gonna do the same. Maybe we can find something else that can be worth stashing on board.
Gargota replied to Gus's statement as she hefted her longlass.
Well, maybe you could toss out the trash. How long do you plan on to lug that thing around with us?
Lawrence addressed her, referring to the charred orcish skull that the Armageddon was holding on to.
What? Him? It's my trophy. I got it fair and square. Not to mention that precautions were taken. I tossed his head in one of the fires to burn all the flesh bits away, so no spores are going to be left in our wake.
Steelix chuckled at the Cadian as she held up the skull, her hands stuck in it as if holding a puppet.
Besides, in a way, he is a part of the team now. Helped out a lot, didn't you, Bucketon?
She then waggled her arm, making it seem as if the skull was speaking, then spoke in her orcish impersonation.
Of course, 'twas me pleasure to help. Dare I say, good old Bucketon was crucial for the operation's success.
As the first lieutenant finished, she flashed the sergeant a mischievous smirk. Dusk instead bore a cold and deathly deadpan, which briefly changed into a pained cringe as he breathed in and slowly exhaled before grimly uttering,
Never do that again. At least not near me.
He then hefted his own lasgun and walked away.
I'm gonna go stretch my legs somewhere far away from here now.
A quiet chuckle of satisfaction escaped Gargota as she watched Lawrence walk off.
Oh, how I wish my brigade's old man was here. You can't cause psychic damage unless you're a mutant, he said. How wrong he was. That's right.
Cease! I'm still within earshot.
The Cadian yelled back at her without turning around, which momentarily removed her proud expression, but it promptly returned, followed by a loud laugh. By the virtue of lots, it was Richard's duty to distribute the rations for the squad that day. Almost everyone had gathered at relatively the same place before their time was up, making it an easy task, save for the commissar's bodyguard, who was absent, oddly enough. It was difficult to find Dan, but after a brief search, Bobson spotted him near some rubble, standing in front of a broken shard of glass. The coat of his uniform sprawled over a flat board, with a small iron next to it. As he got closer, he saw a few spots of some substance on the side of the Mordian's neck as he operated a razor on his face.
Captain Cost, sir? I've brought you your rations for today.
Excellent timing. I was just done.
As he said so, the Mordian turned to face the Brotelian and took the small canteen, then proceeded to pour it over his face, washing it off fully whilst making sure to not let a drop touch his shirt, before finally gulping down the mouthful of water that was still left in it. Richard gawked, his mouth agape as a dumbstruck expression grasped his face for several moments.
Sir!
He stammered in protest.
That was your entire ration of water for the day.
I am aware. I have not yet grown old enough to afford the luxury of being senile, boy. So don't talk down to me as if I do.
Sharp and dismissive, Dan handed him back the canteen before turning around to inspect his face in the glass shard. The nonchalant air about the man simply baffled the youth more. We are literally stuck in the middle of hostile territory with extremely limited supplies. Why? Why? Bobson thought over and over until the words that plagued his mind escaped his mouth.
Why? Why are you shaving?
if you have to know, whelp, it is because I cannot grow a proper beard or mustache. Every time I tried, it just came out as sparse, spindling hair, always curling up and never straightening, regardless of the grooming effort put into it. I suspect it is likely a genetic defect of my bloodline, developed in past times of malnourishment before we joined the Guard.
Cost turned his head to glance at his junior.
You seem of a soft and hearty upbringing. Perhaps one day you can grow a garden of your own that will be better than mine, and actually be worthy of admiration.
Then turned back around to examine himself.
What? No, sir, what I mean is, why are you shaving now? And using the little water you have available when we're in a war zone, or dare I say worse, within enemy territory, and our supplies are close to none. It does not make sense.
In response, Cost simply turned his head to glare at Bobson, a look one would normally give to a fool that had just asked a very silly question. Just as Richard was about to cave under the pressure and apologize for having clearly upset his senior, his intentions were interrupted by his response.
Because all the way out here, I am the face of Mordian. You can learn a lot about a man's world from his face, boy. The beauty of Mordian demands absolute perfection, depicted either through gorgeous facial hair, gloriously groomed to make it the envy of even a squat, or through the clean sharpness and ruggedness of the iron jaws bestowed upon us by our home. No imperfection found between these two sides is permissible.
It still did not make sense. Despite Dan's vigorous dispensation of supposed wisdom, the private could not grasp the point of wasting valuable resources for such superficial things. Though among the confusion, another feeling crept upon the Brotelian. Curiosity, aroused from one line of the captain's statement.
If a man's face can really tell you about their homeworld, then what do the faces of the corporal and the quartermaster speak to you, sir?
Very simple. One is dedicated to a world, likely not his own, that was blessed to have a face beautiful and holy enough to be able to hide the vestiges of those in its service, regardless of how lovely or disfigured they are. The other simply comes from an ugly world.
Richard's mind was once again thrown into turmoil, this time of befuddlement. Saying that so casually, he is surely joking. The lad thought to himself before voicing the inquiry.
Surely you jest, Captain. I mean, this wisdom of yours does not make any sense based on reality. Both of us saw Mr. Gruber, when the commissar had him show his face.
As he littered his words out, Bobson's face became gradually redder as he realized the misunderstanding that may have risen from them.
Not the gentleman to my preference, sir, but you have to agree that he looks handsome.
If you honestly believe that pale pain of flesh is his face, then you are thrice the fool I initially figured you for.
The Mordian spat back at him, his tone filled with the venom of disappointment. Apparently satisfied with his own look, the captain began gathering his grooming and cleaning tools back into his bags, while continuing to speak to the shocked private.
Either this backwater of yours is worthy of such a moniker, or you yourself are simply uneducated in history. It would do you well to remedy that. I am no historian, but let me tell you of this, boy. Krieg is an ugly planet. Its people would prefer they were dead than to show their faces to anyone. However, the Emperor needs bodies under which to crush his enemies, and so the Kriegers resign themselves to hiding their faces beneath rubber, leather, and the iron mask of death, all in his service, in a vain attempt to remove the stain that has resulted in their world's ugliness.
After having assembled his bags, Dan turned to face Richard while putting on his coat.
If you choose so, you can say that to the dead man. Though I warn you, your jaw does not look like it can take the result of such a conversation.
With the final button clasped, the Mordian put on his cap. He looked resplendent in his dress uniform. Every fiber of him gleamed like a sun made out of pride and heroism. Despite the filth surrounding the squad during their trek, this man had kept his visage spotless. It was equal parts astonishing and terrifying for the Brotelian, who could only stare back as silent shock and awe colored his own visage. Finally, the senior of the two harnessed his luggage on his back and took up his lasgun, which also gleamed without any imperfection on it. He strode forward with such formidable certitude that Richard instinctively took a step back, as his own body wanted to give the man before it breath to pass and not squash it under his splendor. The lad's supposed poor fortune for the day, however, had not yet ran out, as the beacon of greatness walked right up to him and leaned in, his weighty glare causing the now frozen still private's spine to bend.
I've heard you mutter about how you thought the guardsmen were magnificent and vastly superior to your PDF. I've seen you ogle everyone's gear and demeanor as a pilgrim does a cathedral to our Lord. Whatever curiosities you may hold, allow me to satisfy them for you. Yes, we are better than you, vastly so, but not because we are elevated by some magical force that lets us fly off into space. The reason for it is simply not explainable by mere words.
He planted a finger in the young man's chest.
But with your current disposition, the best that can come out of you is a shield against an enemy's stray fire. So listen closely and listen well, boy. Don't just listen in. Take note and understand what we say. Do not stare, observe, and emulate what we do. Do so, and you might just be able to fit in amongst veteran guardmen, should you survive this deployment.
Richard's heart was pumping. His mind was getting drowsy from the influx of blood, and his body shook from the adrenaline this man had induced in him. Despite it all, however, he did not permit himself to falter further. He intently listened to and absorbed every word that the Mordian imparted to him, until finally, almost by reflex, shooting his right arm up to salute.
Sir, yes, sir.
Cost gave no response via his own expression. He simply continued to glare down at the private for several moments more, as if counting his heartbeats, before finally uttering in an even tone,
Good.
He then swiped the protein pack from Richard and walked past him.
You can begin by scrubbing your rags and flack. After all, the minor inconvenience that you find yourself in a life-or-death struggle against the enemies of mankind is no excuse to not keep your uniform properly pressed and cleaned.
With his final words released, the Mordian bit into his ration and returned to the group. Bobson would trail him with his gaze until the man moved away. But this was not him merely staring. Intense fire blazed in the youth's eyes as he followed every move and mannerism of the captain, putting it to memory before finally letting out a sigh to stabilize himself and returning to the vehicle. At the end of the time for rest, after having finished the maintenance of his gear, the Brotelian noticed that everyone had moved away from the truck. Puzzled, he began searching, only to find the rest kneeling in front of a particularly large piece of debris, their hands crossed into the Holy Aquila over their chests. The sole exception was Ramil, who stood atop the rock-crete and recited passages from a small book that he held open. Carefully and quietly, the private approached the congregation, kneeling down next to Lawrence and crossing his own hands, looking up at Burgundy and soaking in his words. It was a sermon, not too dissimilar to the ones he had heard during his time in the temple. This prospect made him raise a brow, and after a couple of minutes he slightly leaned to the side and whispered to Dusk.
Is the corporal a priest?
Nah, not really.
The sergeant whispered back.
Practically all of the Maccabians are pilgrims. But when it comes to Zeal and the Emperor bothering, each and every one of them can give a cardinal a run for their thrones.
I see, but why is he giving a sermon now?
Boss lady thought it'd be good for morale.
Gus chimed in with a bemused tone.
Although I'd much rather hear battle plans over scripture.
A grumble of displeasure emanated from Johann as he slightly shifted his head, indicating that he was giving them a disapproving glare under his mask.
Oh, don't grumble to me, bootface. You're just begging to get shot.
Can you do not right now?
Gargota's whispers joined theirs.
Oh, look at what you started, kid.
I didn't mean to, I just wanted to be briefed on.
All sound ended with immediate effect as Ramil slammed shut his book and then loudly talked down to the group with obvious irritation and anger in his voice.
The next would-be heretic to interrupt the holy words of Saint Drusus is going to involuntarily deep-throat a frag grenade.
Understandably, everyone who had aided in the interruption's eyes turned to Katerina, who simply stood perfectly still, looking at the Maccabian in placid silence along with Kost. Upon realizing that their commanding officer would not raise any objection to Burgundy's threat, they all simmered down and returned to their positions of prayer and quieted. Ramil, in turn, nodded approvingly and continued, opening the book to the page he had been on, indicating that he clearly knew the text's contents by heart.
Good. Now, as I recite it, Chapter 4 of Tablet 4, Passage 12. One must not be ignorant as to mistake zeal and ambition, for ambition is a flawed drive, prone to stagnancy caused by the stranglehold of machination for personal benefit. Zeal, in turn, is immune to the condemnable diseased flaws of stagnation and those of serpentine scheming, for zeal is the very radiance of order, ever surging onwards into the light of our Lord's service. A soldier, nay, any man for that matter, must remain resolute in his faith, and therefore pursue the Emperor's will in unquestionable zeal, by remaining steadfast in his divine providence. No assassin, armed with bolt, blade, or poison, may bring him low into the cold and unforgiving clutches of doom, for death and damnation pale before his might and glory that envelops the faithful. Ave Imperator!
The rest of the sermon proceeded with no issue. While some showed meager, visible inclinations of displeasure of sitting through it, Richard found it to be very uplifting, soaking in the wisdom of the great man, whose visage bore the corporal as its vessel. When the Maccabian stepped down and into the now standing fold, the commissar began her own briefing.
I hope you all found this to be a stimulating experience, because the news about our situation is not too flowery. While yesterday's haul can be considered a bountiful for a group as small as ours, it is not really satisfactory for our intentions. In short, it is not enough to support an overland trip. Either our food or that of the truck will run out first, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere.
I suppose that settles us trying to find the trams. But will the fuel and foodstuffs be enough for that kind of trip either?
Probably not, but since the underhive is bound to be more intact than the surface, it will be more likely for us to find additional provisions on our way down in order to supplement our current supplies.
At this point, she turned to the Brotelian.
Do you know of any exits out of this hive section that lead down the spires?
Yes, sir.
Rather uncharacteristically, Richard replied with more confidence in his tone as he stiffened up to stand at attention.
I do believe there's a map and supplies. With it I'll be able to navigate us. Though the route is rather significant, I don't believe we'll be able to reach the descent tunnel for another couple of days.
The information was considered for a few moments until a command was produced from it.
In that case, board up. We will drive as far as possible until sunset, at which point we will make another stop, so we can go through another sleep cycle.
I do not think that would be necessary, sir. I am confident I can endure the waking world for at least 72 more hours, and, if necessary, I can use one of my combat stims.
Cost spoke up in a similarly serious tone as he also stood at attention.
I do not doubt you, Captain, but I'd rather have you fresh on the road and your stims preserved for actually important times. We'll rest once we make our next stop, and you will not use any of your doses without my express permission. That is an order.
One might have expected a scowl to color Cost's face, but none came. His visage remained neutral and unflinching as he nodded in affirmation and uttered,
Understood, sir.
Morden trying to talk back? What's next? Ogre and scribes?
Gus muttered as to not be heard by the leading pair.
Goes to show that despite their dedication, they are just as fallible and prone to damnation as any man.
Ramil agreed. Before any further comments could be made, Katerina moved towards the truck and beckoned the rest over with a sweep of her hand.
Enough chit-chat. Board and prepare for travel. Private, you come with me so we can get that map. I also need to get myself one of the las pistols.
That statement made a few of the group raise a brow out of curiosity.
If I may, sir, why would you want a pea-shooter flashlight when you strap in a Godwin?
Arconi's expression soured at the question, prompting her to sigh before clarifying.
My Godwin's extended clip had the, as far as we know, last 30 blast boards in Imperial hands on this planet. Now there are 26 of them, since, quite obviously, such caliber of equipment wouldn't be lying around the Mises storage facilities in this hive. I would rather not waste the remaining ones unless absolutely necessary.
Despite it being just a simple confirmation of available resources, her words strung a chord with the whole squad. Knowing that one of the most powerful expressions of humanity's might was dwindled to such a short supply and was practically non-existent in their surroundings manifested the image of the Imperium in miniature within the minds of the more philosophically inclined among them, while the rest simply endured the guttural feeling of unease. Stomaching it down, the 8 elected to distract themselves from the thought by focusing on the task at hand, assembling anything they had taken off the truck for their rest session and boarding. As a minor blessing, the resumed drive was relatively uneventful. The only difference with the previous one was that Gargota now covered their rear, while Richard found himself on the front seat, reading the map of the hive along the commissar, guiding Dan through the various sections of road that were intact enough to drive on. What could be considered unfortunate about the journey was that by the time dusk began to fall, the area they reached was relatively flat and barren, leaving the group rather exposed. Due to this, they elected to detour over to a demolished section of the hive, which provided more optimal concealment. Among the ruins, the guardsmen pitched a few tents they had scavenged from the Emperor's Springfields and settled for the night, once again operating in hourly shifts. Once again, the Brutalian's shift ended up taking place deep in the night. Still, inspired by his conversation with the Mordian and the subsequent sermon, Richard had decided to be more proactive, so he began to stealthily patrol the perimeter, making sure that their camp remained properly concealed and that no enemies were nearby. The admirable effort seemed to be somewhat in vain, as no threat presented itself right up until the end of the shift when Bobson made his way back to the camp. Upon re-entering the perimeter, he would be surprised to see Cost awake and standing guard in front of Arconi's tent. The private was about to wave and call over to the captain, but halted himself as his eyes were able to identify a large shape approaching stealthily from the opposite side of the rubble. Seemingly by instinct, Richard dove to the side and hid, mentally cursing at himself for apparently trying to not be seen by a potential enemy. The subsequent silence, however, prompted him to slowly poke his head to investigate. His initial impression that the large figure was an enemy was dashed when he identified Dan standing perfectly still, moving only to open entry into the tent behind him, which had light pouring out from the inside. To the Brotalian's shock, the glow's illumination revealed the form to be Johann, who was let into the tent before the captain closed it. Any sensible individual in the Brotalian's shoes at this very moment would have simply ignored what they just saw, turned around and evacuated. Unfortunately for his sensibilities, Richard felt like an arrested feline pushed in front of a firing squad by his curiosity. By the time a rational thought grabbed the reins of his mind, he had unconsciously snuck up closer behind the tent, apparently just in time to hear quiet speech coming out of it.
Is now really an appropriate time to be doing this, sir?
I need this now. I can't risk something stupid happening like yesterday and taking your head off before we do it.
Katerina's voice carried a distinct note of desperation.
So what if it does? You're bound to find plenty of people like me when you make it to Hive to Heiden.
Whatever urgency spurred on the commissar, Gruber showed no interest in it. If anything, he sounded like he did not want to be present for whatever was happening. Involuntary. The word flashed over Bobson's widening eyes as he continued to snoop.
Just because your kind multiplies like flies doesn't mean people with your skills are readily available. For me, this is necessary as quickly as possible, so get to it.
Arconi snapped back, clearly irritated, before adding in a more menacing tone.
And remember, if you tell anyone about this or perform poorly, I won't even give you the dignity of a board round, as I will kill you immediately with whatever is on hand.
The private's blood ran cold. He figured the commissar was a stern and scary person, but she had left no impression that she was willing to abuse her power for such things that the Brotelian dared not even voice them in his own mind. Doubly so with the youngest member of the squad. What shook him further was the Krieger's response.
There will be no need for that. Your preferences are strange to me, but I know what I'm doing.
That only added to Bobson's confusion. Was this actually mutually consensual and not as bad as he had imagined it initially? Shortly after, the muffled noises began. At that point, the need for self-preservation overtook curiosity's clutches on Richard's body as he immediately dropped belly down on the ground. Adrenaline-rich blood surged through him as he began to crawl away, both as quietly and as quickly as possible, drawing upon his training as the sensation that an autogun was being fired above his head drove him forward. After a couple of minutes, he was far enough to stand up and hastily run towards the truck, pressing his back against its frame and sliding down into a sitting position, while his chest rapidly rose and fell as the adrenaline high wore off. Despite the significant difference between the two, Bobson felt that he had just escaped a situation far more deadly than the orcoid attempting to cut open his throat from the previous day. Though, as his mind raced and began to analyze what had happened, escaped felt like an incorrect description. Evaded fit better, as he was still within striking distance of the danger and would henceforth be under duress to hide from it.
Hey, Tiny, you can go to sleep. I'm here to take over this shift.
The Brotelian yelped in surprise and fell on his back, completely missing the Catachan's casual approach. Gus, in turn, immediately tensed up and began looking around while asking,
What's wrong? Why are you so panicked? Did you see any enemies?
Just as he was about to reply, the commissar's words washed over his mind.
And remember, if you tell anyone about this, I won't even give you the dignity of a board round, as I will kill you immediately with whatever is on hand.
Preventing him from blurting out something lethal to himself. Instead, he tried to catch his breath and stammered out.
No, I did not encounter any enemies. Everything is fine and quiet. I just, you know that I am not the same caliber as the rest of you guys, and that the, battle from yesterday really shook me. I was just reflecting on it, and the, almost dying part. So I wasn't in the best headspace this late of night, hence why I didn't notice you and got startled.
Wildknife momentarily raised an eyebrow at the pathetic display before him, before closing his eyes, shaking his head, and sighing as he returned to a calm posture. He then opened them and looked down at Bobson.
Kid, you really gotta work on growing that pear. I get that you come from a softy planet, but even so, for someone your age, this is shameful.
An urge to snap back and set the record straight bubbled deep in Richard's gut. With a lot of effort, he suppressed it and put on a fake sheepish smile before replying.
Yeah, you're right. The captain said basically the same when I caught him in conversation in the morning.
Bobson sighed, then resumed with a note of forced courage in his voice.
He did give me a few good pointers, so I'll be doing my best to not be a burden and be of use to the team, while also becoming a man and servant that both myself and the Emperor can be proud of.
The second lieutenant studied the young man for a few moments, then shook his head again, but with a faint smile on his features.
It's not much, but those are definitely better words and a better mindset than what I just saw.
After saying so, Gust reached down, grabbing the private by the arm and pulled him up with one hand.
You keep that mental, Tiny. It's bound to bring you better places. Now go pass out. Wouldn't want the boss lady to court-martial us both for not swapping fast enough.
A single gulp went down the Brotolian's throat at the mention of Katerina, but he maintained his more confident expression and saluted, saying,
My thanks, Lieutenant.
Following which he went to climb in the back of the truck for the night.
Good grief.
Wildknife chuckled as he went ahead to scout out the area, just in case while his shift was on.
Really goofy, that one. But it's not that bad. Almost makes me feel bad for trying to slit his throat.
When dawn broke the darkness, Cost informed everyone that the commissar would take a bit longer, as she felt something might be off with her from the collision with the tech-adept orc's claw, giving everyone a bit of time for any manner of morning routine they may have wanted to perform. Given the fairly turbulent evening that he had gone through while asleep, Richard realized that he would not be able to stifle his imagination, so he decided to use this time to distract it by focusing on his personal project in the back of the truck. Several minutes later, his focus was demanded by the quartermaster knocking on the vehicle's railing.
Here's your rations, useless. As much as I love wasting them on you, orders are orders.
Following which, he casually tossed the canteen and protein bar next to Bobson, who in turn replied,
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
Then lifted the former for a quick drink. Gruber was just about to turn and leave, but in the motion, his side glance caught sight of the morning light reflecting off of something gold in the private's lap. Admittedly, if the trope was handling contraband, it would be more appropriate to let him slide on the Mordian's ire. But his own fixation on doing things by the book got the best of the young Krieger, prompting him to lift himself up on the spare tire in order to get a better view and ask,
What's that? You hiding something?
Oh, this... Heh.
Richard chuckled lightly as he set down his canteen.
No, it's just a side project, you could say, that I've picked up after I finished fixing all the uniforms.
He then picked up the ends of the cloth in his lap, lifting it up and spreading it to reveal a patchwork of dark colors, bar a few that formed a line of red, the centerpiece of which was a half-torn aquila, bearing the open eye that looks to the future.
I found this and a couple of other pieces that wouldn't really be useful for stitching up uniforms, but I honestly felt bad at the thought of just dumping them. So I figured when I could restore it to some semblance of glory, using the discarded pieces possibly as a kind of banner for the squad.
He then set it down and turned to face the Krieger.
I get that it sounds super naive and whatnot, but it feels quite fitting, don't you think? We are more or less a patchwork of leftovers, struggling against our doom by standing united in our common faith in humanity.
Johann remained quiet, save for the heavy breathing emanating from his gas mask, his glass eyes boring into the man across from him for several intense moments, until he finally spoke.
Well, you stumped me. I don't know whether to ridicule you for wasting space and material or to congratulate you on having a not utterly retarded idea. In either case, you're still useless, though.
With that, he jumped off and turned to leave.
Hey, Johann, wait!
Richard called after him, surprised to see that Gruber actually halted and looked back at him.
What?
The Brotolian focused in search of the proper words with which to convey his thought process.
Wanted to ask, how are you?
Annoyed I have to spend time with you all. Your point?
No, I get that, it's just... Have you talked about anything more specific with maybe the captain? Or had to do anything objectionable, even if enjoyable, that you agreed to?
Despite the gas mask, judging by the slight shifts in body language, Bobson guessed that his compatriot was raising a brow at him before replying.
I've been grudgingly mincing words with everyone. Nothing really special. And objectionable? Wasting valuable assets to keep you lot alive is already objectionable enough.
Johann would make a slight pause before addressing the latter half of the second question.
Though maybe I have found something not dreadful or kind of interesting to do, but that's none of your business.
I see. Well, me and Cost briefly talked about some philosophical stuff yesterday, and I disagreed with some of his sentiments.
You're lucky you don't have a split lip then. Stupid as it might be to argue with someone whose rot in the rear can be seen when they speak. It is also daring, I give you that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in that regard, how do I put this? I don't think your face is ugly.
Inexplicably, Richard felt as though he was in the grip of the orc from yesterday, and the world around him was being squashed, as the betrayal of his brain dawned upon him when he realized he had mixed up wanting to say that the Krieger's world was not ugly, and Dan's statement about how a man's face could tell you of his world. The sensation tripled when he noticed Johann slightly lean away and take a small step backwards, his posture clearly indicating mild discomfort, and asking,
Are you trying to flirt with me?
What? No, Emperor, no!
The private stammered out, extending his open palms in protest. After doing so, his arms and head dropped, accompanied by a sigh of defeat. With a heavy breath, he looked back at Gruber and spoke in a clear tone.
What I was trying to communicate with this whole exchange is that while rank may separate us, age-wise I am your senior, and from my days back at the temple I was raised at, I've acclimated to being the older brother figure that looks after his juniors. And after hearing some opinions going around, I was just concerned that you may have been deprived of sleep more than the rest of us. So I just wanted to let you know that if you need someone to talk to about things, I'm always willing to lend an ear.
Another deafening silence ensued, lingering even longer than the last one. Richard was about to smile in success when he saw the quartermaster stand a bit more firm, but before he could do so, any hope for a positive outcome was smothered by the Krieger's next words.
Not only useless, you were also extremely weird. I would literally rather talk with the Xeno-skull that Steelix looks around instead of you. Please take every possible offense with that statement.
At which point he finally left, with a mild hurry in his step. Utterly defeated, Richard buried his face in his hands and fell on his back inside of the truck and let out one single groan of pain.
God, Emperor, please just kill me now.
Special thanks to all these gits that help make this possible. Remember to like and subscribe, and check him out in the description below. Hope you enjoyed this here story, and we's looking to see you back next time. Can I go now, Yume?
No.
Oh.